Hi, everyone. My name is Patricia Bitar, and I am a freelance writer and translator, and I have the honor of presenting Adam Shriver today. So Adam Shriver is a philosopher and an ethicist of cognitive science, conducting research on the intersection of ethics and cognitive science at the Oxford UHERO Center for Practical Ethics. More specifically, Adam's work looks at the significance of the dissociation between the affective and sensory components of pain in human and other animal beings, which raises the major issue regarding the capacity for suffering across different species. In this regard, Adam has written multiple articles about human well-being and other animals' welfare. He has organized a workshop on the ethics of neuroscience research on animals and is currently editing a book on the topic. He hopes to investigate the nonverbal assessment of pain and welfare across different contexts. In his commentary on Brian Key's article, Why Fish Do Not Feel Pain, published in 2016 in the Animal Sentience Journal, Adam argues that it is a mistake to conclude, as does Key, that other species lack the conscious experience of pain in virtue of lacking the same cortical areas involved in the experience of pain by humans. So let us hear Adam on this topic. Thank you.
Thank you. I am happy to report that the previous presentations, and Reuven's in particular, have sort of nicely set up a lot of the things that I'm going to say in this presentation. So what would have otherwise been completely unmotivated proselytizing is now very motivated proselytizing with a sort of clear target. Just to note a couple things, I'm going to follow Lars' lead and mention my support right away, because I will probably forget it as well. So I got a nice grant from Effective Altruism Grants to study pain, and I'm not a scientist, so I'm not used to getting grants, so that's why it's easy for me to forget these things. And the other thing to sort of note about my title slide is that there's a lot of mention of ethics in my affiliations, and I think that really, I have training in cognitive science and ethics, but I think it's maybe a valuable perspective to also be coming from the ethical perspective when you're thinking about these issues. I know ethics is sort of, or at least it's sort of one of the three key questions you're considering in this course. And so it's useful to keep in mind that when we're talking about sentience, sometimes sentience is used as a sort of stand-in for moral status, but sentience itself may not be always morally relevant. It's really valenced sentience that sort of clearly seems to have value for us, right? So positive or negative experiences seem to be valuable in themselves, or at least as we experience them. So that's why I sort of focus a lot on pleasure and pain in asking these questions. So the title question, do human lesion studies tell us the cerebral cortex is required for pain? So in this course, you guys have been hearing people talk about or ask if plants might be conscious, if insects might be conscious. And so you might think, why would we need to ask a question this dumb? Who actually thinks that the cerebral cortex might be required for pain? But it actually is a pretty surprisingly mainstream view, as I'm sure Stephen can attest. Quite a few high-profile neuroscientists are committed to the view that cortical regions, and specifically the sort of cortical regions that are associated with very high-level human thought and language, might be necessary for conscious experience. So I pulled quotes from a few of them, but Ledoux's big-name neuroscientist says emotions are higher-order states instantiated in cortical circuits. Bud Craig claims that consciousness is dependent upon activity in the Insula cortex. The institution I'm at also has a lot of scientists who are very committed to this idea that the cortex is necessary for conscious experience. So Edmund Rawls says that consciousness may be the state which arises in a system that can think about or reflect on its own or other people's thoughts. That is a system capable of second or higher order thoughts, which he thinks is only possible in the cortex. Again, other people sort of suggest, specifically in relation to pain, that the insula cortex might be required to truly have painful experiences. So it's actually a pretty common view among neuroscientists, in spite of maybe the range of presentations that you guys have gotten in this excellent course. I'm going to argue against the view that the cerebral cortex is necessary for conscious pain, although I am going to suggest that we have good reason to believe that having a better understanding of how the cerebral cortex is involved in pain will actually be very valuable for the types of questions that you guys are examining in this course. Before I sort of dive in a little more, I do want to take a step back and just sort of mention this idea that, I think as, coming from an ethical perspective, I think it's sort of easy to take the perspective, well, why shouldn't we just sort of always err on the side of caution and always just sort of treat any sort of organism or any animal as sentient and act accordingly as a result of that, right? That seems like, we should be compassionate, and if you don't know, why not sort of err on the side of caution? And I definitely agree with that in general, but there are, in addition to just the fact that the scientific questions are interesting in themselves, there are also ethical questions that depend on sort of having a more precise answer to these questions of which animals are sentient or not. So in some contexts, it might be okay to err on the side of caution. So just to start out, I mean, the reason this is the case is because no one is really certain about the correct account of phenomenal consciousness, right? You've heard all range of views and so far. There's all kinds of ideas about what consciousness is. No one can be really certain about it. So what we're really faced with is the question of how to proceed in the face of various degrees of uncertainty. We might approach this question very differently in different contexts. And in particular, I think we can distinguish between what I would say a pragmatic answer to the question which organisms are sentient and a precise answer to that question. So pragmatic answers. If we're trying to decide whether an animal is sentient, we say, do I save the moth that got stuck in my apartment? I might say, well, I don't know if the moth is sentient or not. But nevertheless, it seems like the sort of nice thing to do would be to save the moth and let it outside. And so it seems like a sort of obvious choice to make in the face of uncertainty. I also think, if we're thinking about the question of should we refrain from eating food products that come from situations that potentially cause suffering to non-human animals, including fish, octopuses, insects, cases that might be sort of more borderline than other mammals. It seems to me like it's in the Western world, it's pretty easy to sort of refrain from those practices that sort of potentially cause suffering and to choose, a mostly plant-based diet without having major impairment of your own well-being. So to me, that seems like another case where there's a very pragmatic sort of answer that allows you to err on the side of caution. But there are other types of questions where you really do need a more precise answer. So for example, if I have $1,000 to donate to the Montreal SPCA, and they're trying to decide whether they should have a campaign to improve the welfare of cows, chickens, or fish, well, there are many more chickens that are eaten in modern farming situations than there are cows, but there are also many more fish that are consumed in the sort of fish practice. And so there's always kind of an argument for going further away from the sort of humanish, the more human-like animals on the chain. But if you think that cows are more likely to be sentient or chickens are more likely to be sentient than fish, that can sort of push against the sort of purely numbers-based arguments of only looking at which animals are most affected by those numbers. Similarly, ethical questions come up when we're asking, should we replace a pig in an experiment? Should we think that replacing a pig with a rat is an improvement in experimental settings? Are we doing something better by doing that? Or a monkey with a pig? Those types of things. And those questions depend, to some degree on what we think the moral status is of those animals and sort of what level of certainty we assign to that. I'll sort of skip over some of these, but just the basic point is that the degree of confidence we have about sentience matters quite a bit in some contexts. And just to sort of point out too that these questions really aren't just limited to animals. I think it's sometimes it's easy for people to sort of hand wave and be like, well, you know, we don't know, but it's no big deal. But you know, these questions of who consciously feels pain or not also comes up in the case of fetuses, right? So it's a big issue in the sort of abortion debate. There are very like preterm infants that are born sort of 25 weeks after gestation that you might ask, and they are required to have very sort of noxious procedures done on them as just part of routine medical care. So there are important questions that come up there. They're behaviorally unresponsive humans. They're humans with serious cognitive impairments. So these ethical questions kind of come up over and over. And so it's not really that easy to just sort of say, well, we don't really know, you know, and we'll just sort of think about this later or leave it to other people to sort of think about these questions. Okay, so proselytizing discursion 1 finished, and returning to the target question, do human lesion studies tell us that the cortex is required for pain? Human lesion studies, basically the basic sort of idea is to look at people who have damage to particular brain regions and see what capabilities are impaired. This actually used to be one of the few methods that scientists had for investigating the relationship between brain structure and function, right? Pre-cognitive revolution, where now we have all these techniques where you can sort of see what's going on in the brain. This used to be one of the only ways people had of sort of linking particular brain regions to particular functions. The earliest examples were, of course, naturally occurring lesions, so people who had strokes or other sorts of damage that occurred just throughout their life, and you had to wait until a person passed away in order to examine their brain, unlike today where we can use imaging techniques to see whether someone has brain damage while they're still alive. A couple famous examples of this. Broca's area is a part of the brain that was discovered by scientist Broca, who found 2 patients who had damage to this particular part of the brain, who had trouble producing language. So there's sort of, they named the region after him for this discovery. And then the case over here, some people may recognize the case of Phineas Gage, who was this railway worker who, by all accounts, was very methodical and a good planner and all that kind of thing. And some accident happened where a rod was jammed up through his brain and he miraculously survived. But afterwards, he became sort of a, someone who was impulsive, no longer could plan, got into drunken brawls. His personality changed dramatically. And so the idea was, something about what happened to his brain was affecting his behavior. Okay, so just to kind of simplify what the basic idea is, and this is an admittedly flawed way of presenting it, and maybe no scientist has ever actually believed quite this way of thinking about it, but just to get the idea out there, you might think that the way to think about how lesion studies can inform us is that if brain region X is damaged and cognitive function Y is impaired after the damage, then X must play a role in Y. And you might think sort of the converse of that: if brain region X is damaged and cognitive function Y is preserved, then X must not play a role in that cognitive function. So just sort of the sort of connection between structure and function is pretty you can sort of see the basic idea there. There are a number of flaws with this way of thinking that have been sort of outlined quite extensively, and I sort of numbered them 1 and 2 so you can sort of see which ones the flaws apply to. But first of all, in naturally occurring lesions, there's always an N of 1, right? So no 2 people's brain lesions are going to be the same, but we know that there are important differences between individual people's brains, so it's hard to make inferences based on a lesion in one person. We also, most of the time, don't know the prior state of the people. So someone has a lesion to a particular brain area, and then they're bad at math. Maybe they were bad at math before they had the lesion. So it's sort of hard to know unless you've already done sort of extensive cognitive testing. Damage is rarely confined to particular areas. Typically, damage spreads. So, a lot of the stroke lesions involve brain regions not getting enough oxygen. And so typically damage is spread across multiple regions. So it's hard to sort of really pinpoint one specific region and say that's the sort of true cause of a certain deficit. Projecting axons from connecting neurons might also be damaged. So if you have a lesion to a particular area that involves, sort of cross-brain traffic, axons, connecting to another part of the brain, it may be the blocking of a connection that's causing a deficit rather than the damage to that particular area. It's also the case that certain brain regions might be redundant. So they might be involved in certain cognitive functions, but not necessary for them. So you might have a case where there's damage to a particular region, and the cognitive activity can still be performed, but nevertheless, that region did have some involvement in it. And finally, there's also a lot of brain plasticity, which we talked about a little bit in the sort of stuff about cases with the blind people who learned how to use echolocation, where new regions can eventually cover some of the same tasks. So there are a lot of flaws with sort of using at least the simplistic version of lesion studies to try to infer structure-function relationships. Those objections I raised were mostly focused on the idea of these sort of naturally occurring lesions. Later on, maybe in the at least in the 50s, maybe a couple decades before that too, neuroscientists started using targeted lesions to try to treat certain medical conditions. And the reason I have treat both in quotations and not in quotations is because some of the earlier uses of these lesions were very clunky, and they might have taken out a huge chunk of brain tissue and said, oh, look, now this person no longer gets angry, but they might also be lacking a lot of other cognitive functions as well. But nowadays, there's at least some types of uses of selective lesions that are a little bit more precise. For ethical reasons, focal lesions can only be directed at small subset of areas that are clinically necessary for treating patients. So there are kind of limitations on how much you can use these targeted lesions to investigate stuff. Okay, but I'm going to argue that the lesion method could still be invaluable in investigating sentience specifically in combination with some other techniques. So first of all, I'm going to say that it can demonstrate that particular phenomenon are more complicated than previously believed by demonstrating selective impairment of one aspect of the function. So by showing that two things can be dissociated, we might show that certain concepts that we have should be split. Lesions can also demonstrate that particular brain regions are not necessary for particular cognitive functions, at least in a sort of strong sense of necessary that I'll talk about later. And cases where new brain regions, and this is the part I'm kind of most excited about, cases where new brain regions take up the processing of damaged regions might tell us something important about how the processing is taking place. Okay, so on to the topic of pain, which I'm very happy was sort of previously talked about. Is Ruben in the room? Yeah. Oh, good to see you. Okay. All right, so nociception, pain, and suffering. Three things that are all related, but just how much is a topic of debate. Like Ruben, I will appeal to some definitions, and I sent my slides to Melissa in advance so she can vouch for the fact that I had these in even before your presentation, Ruben. So it's nothing personal. So as Ruben already mentioned, we have this definition of nociceptors, which are basically high threshold sensory receptors of the peripheral somatosensory nervous system that's capable of transducing and encoding noxious stimuli, right? So nociceptors are these specialized nerve endings in our peripheral nervous system that translate energy from the environment into a signal that goes into our nervous system. And so I think given that and this is based on the IASP definition of nociceptors, the International Association for the Study of Pain, which sort of has this whole taxonomic committee that talks about these things. So it's a pretty good definition. And I think given that we know what nociceptors are, the sort of natural way of defining what nociception is, which may be cheating a little. Ruben, feel free to call me out if you think this is cheating. But I think the right way to define nociception is basically a nervous system response that involves significant activation of nociceptors, right? So if you have nociceptors that are active and they send a signal to the nervous system, that's sufficient for nociception. Okay, so typical case of pain, nociceptive pain, you have one of these one of these things occurs, you can have heat pain or chemical reaction or some type of pressure or coldness. Different specialized aspects of the peripheral nervous system pick up these things, send it to the to synapse in the dorsal root ganglion of the spinal cord, which then sends a signal up to the thalamus. Story to be continued a little bit later, but that's the sort of traditional case of what happens during a painful experience is the signal from the peripheral nervous system gets transmitted up to the brain. Okay, so then we can ask, is nociception pain? On some old models, that you might have thought so. So Descartes had this model of pain, which was sort of called the somewhat now sort of slightly derisively called the bell ringing model of pain, which was sort of the idea that there's just kind of a string. I mean, I don't think he meant this literally, but it was a sort of representation of, there's almost like a string that goes up to the brain, and if something happens at the bottom, you pull the string and a bell rings. And so there's this sort of direct connection between the periphery and the sort of the experience of pain itself, of course, mediated by the soul in Descartes' case. But okay, so I'm going to argue that nociception should not be considered pain. I think there are pretty good reasons for this, but I'll start with bad reasons. So in the olden days, I will not say the good old days because I agree with Reuven and other speakers that people were much too cavalier about this. But in the olden days, people might have said, well, of course, nociception is not pain because nociception can occur in these really simple organisms like aplysia or like C. elegans or fruit flies. So it must not be the same thing as pain because nociception occurs in these simple organisms. And I think that the context of this course has very nicely established that we shouldn't rule out the idea that these organisms are capable of feeling pain. And so that would be a very bad sort of argument for saying that nociception can't be the same thing as pain. But there are slightly more challenging cases. So headless cockroaches, it turns out, and sorry, these are sort of gruesome experiments that I don't know why they sort of did this, but they did. They've done experiments with headless, decapitated cockroaches, and they found that not only could they sort of hold their limbs up above electrified solutions, but they could sort of learn to kind of avoid things. So they had a sort of rudimentary learning. I don't remember the exact details, but they could, headless cockroaches could sort of undergo, could sort of perform nociceptive behaviors, and you might think that's a slightly more challenging case than the other ones, but I don't even want to rely on that intuition. Maybe you think headless cockroaches do feel pain, because I don't think we need to, because we know in the case of humans that we have nociception all the time without having conscious pain. Without having pains that we can report. So, for example, soldiers in battle often have severe tissue damage without experiencing any pain at the time. Nociception still occurs in vegetative patients. They'll still grimace and sort of respond to certain type of stimuli, even though they're technically brain dead. And I think maybe the most convincing case are people who have spinal transactions where the spinal cord no longer sends a signal up to the brain. Those people can tell us that they're not in pain. But if you think that nociception just is the activity of nociceptors sending a signal to the nervous system, then we can say that they do have nociception, but they don't have pain. So I think there are good reasons for distinguishing nociception and pain. And maybe some people use nociception in a way that isn't very clearly distinguished from pain, but I think there are reasons for keeping the terms separate. Oops. Whoa. Way back. What's that? Oh.
Hi, I just have a question.
Sure.
So you just said that nociception, people with a cut in their spinal cord do have nociception, but in your definition of nociception, you mentioned that it goes to the spinal cord, then to the brain. But if you keep in mind that definition, technically it doesn't go all the way up to the brain, as there's a section that is severed, no? I'm not sure I'm clear about my question.
Well, so the spinal cord is technically still part of the central nervous system, I think. So, so the way I'm using nociception, it would count as nociception. But you're right, you might want to define nociception. I mean, if someone defines nociception as brain activity as a result of the activity of nociceptors, then you might say that nociception is more likely to be pain. But I think the way I use the definition sort of ruled out.
Okay, so any kind of receptor that goes anywhere between the spinal cord and the brain is nociception.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. So that might be why you could accuse me of cheating. But I think that's why the sort of, I think that's consistent with the way pain researchers use the terms, because when they want to be able to distinguish nociception, like what's happening in the periphery, from the actual conscious experience of pain. So that's why I think there are sort of good reasons for keeping them separate. The other type of reason we have for keeping them separate is that you can definitely have pains without nociception, right? So phantom limb pains are cases where people might be missing a limb, and nevertheless, they sort of feel as though they're having a pain in that part of their body. So there's no peripheral nerve fibers reacting as a result of a limb, because they don't have a limb, and nevertheless, they say that they experience pain, and I think we should believe them. There are also cases like thalamic pain, where there's nothing going on at all in the spinal cord. There's just sort of a damage to a particular brain region that causes someone to experience pain. So there's no nociception in pain. There's no nociception, but there is pain in those cases. So I think we have a good example of a sort of double dissociation type case, where we can sort of clearly distinguish cases of pain without nociception, cases of nociception without pain.
I just want to check one thing with you, okay? I get the double dissociation, nociception without, let me not say pain. Nociception that doesn't hurt without nociception. That's the dissociation, right?
No, that's coming later.
Why?
Because I think we can be even more fine-grained. I think we can rule out nociception, but then we can also sort of talk about more specific things. So I'll get to it just a second.
So you're going to make a distinction between pain and hurting?
Yeah, or unpleasantness.
Well, that's getting nuanced.
Okay, so some people proceed, again, just to remind you, coming from this sort of ethics perspective, what we care about is not just any type of sentience. What we care about is sentience that feels bad or feels good. Just to kind of keep that in the background, we can sort of ask this question of, can we demonstrate that an aversive response to a noxious stimulus is a morally significant pain just by showing that it's not merely nociception, right? So if you take my argument for if you accept my argument, nociception is not pain, we might say, oh, well, if there's a response that's not just nociception, then it must be this morally significant phenomenon, just by showing it's not morally significant. And so you see these kinds of arguments in the literature, where someone will say, here's my definition of nociception. This isn't nociception. Therefore, it must be pain, and it must be sort of morally important. And they might not be using the same definition of nociception as me, but I'm going to argue that even that distinction sort of doesn't go far enough in what we should be looking for. Okay, so pain without suffering sounds like a very strange idea, as Stephen's puzzlement indicated. But it turns out that there are people who have lesions to particular parts of the brain who report that they still feel pain, but that they no longer find those pains unpleasant. This is very puzzling, of course, because it seems like unpleasantness is just an intrinsic part of what the pain experience is, right? It's sort of, that's part of what it means for something to be a pain. Nevertheless, this is what people report. Okay, so what's going on in these cases? It turns out that there's a sort of nice brain-based explanation of what might be happening in these cases. So to return to my previous story about what happens to the pain signal, once you have a signal in the spinal cord, it goes up through the spinal cord and synapses in the thalamus, and it actually splits into at least two different directions. Some people might want to split it even further, but there are two different pathways that it travels. One pathway goes primarily to the somatosensory cortex, S1, and another pathway goes through the insula and the anterior cingulate cortex. And so these pathways are named the sensory pain pathway and the affective pain pathway. And they seem to underlie different aspects of pain experience. So the lateral pathway, or the sensory pain pathway, seems to mediate our ability to localize the pain. So to say that it's in our foot rather than our hand, to say, oh, sorry, that shouldn't be a texture, it should be intensity, to say the intensity of the pain, how strong of a pain it is, and also the modality of the pain, whether it's a cutting pain or a burning pain or something else. So those things are all sort of processed in the somatosensory cortex, and you can sort of show that, they're nicely correlated with that. However, there's another dimension of pain experience that's called the affective dimension of pain, and this dimension of pain experience is is involved in how much a person minds the pain, how unpleasant they find it, and also maybe the same thing, maybe a different thing, how motivated they are to escape that experience. So there are these sort of two different pathways that arguably sort of underlie these different aspects of pain experience.
So the affective pathway would explain as well the people who like bondage and BDSM and that type of stuff, like that they find real pleasure in it?
That's a good question. I think there are a lot of different interpretations of what's going on in those cases. My interpretation is that the pleasure system and the pain system are two different systems. And so in cases where people sort of enjoy painful experiences, they might just have more pleasure that sort of outweighs the pain that they're experiencing, because you can have simultaneous pleasure and pain. So it might just be that they sort of get both the painful experience and the pleasure, but maybe the pleasure is sort of dampening exactly how painful it feels. But yeah, it's sort of an interesting question that I think people are still thinking about. There's a nice researcher named Siri Leknes who does a lot of interesting stuff about the relationship between pleasure and pain. Okay, so medial pain pathway, the aversiveness of pain, the unpleasantness of pain. There have been a lot of studies, fMRI studies, that show the anterior cingulate is one of the most frequently activated regions during pain studies. And it turns out that there's this procedure known as cingulotomies that are done to treat cases of chronic pain in people who have cancer, terminal cancer. And after people have these procedures performed, they will report that they still feel the pain, but it's not distressing, not particularly bothersome, or doesn't worry me anymore. These procedures are still done today, actually, in rare circumstances to treat intractable cancer pain. And so they do sort of pretty reliably help with at least one aspect of painful experience. And just to sort of show on the diagram, these are the lesions to the anterior cingulate in these cingulotomy cases. And, this study's from, I don't see the year on there, but I think it's, the 90s or the 2000s, they're still doing this. Okay, so the anterior cingulate is one of these key regions in the affective pain pathway. There's also the insula cortex and the parietal operculum. And so some people have argued that these are an even more representative type of case of this dissociation. And in these cases, people will report that they still feel pain, but they won't even show any withdrawal reactions to new pains. Sometimes they even laugh when you poke them with a pinprick. But nevertheless, they will all claim that they can recognize pain, but that they don't find it unpleasant. And this is sort of an old diagram. And these are the painy symbolia are more rare cases, but which is why this is such an old-looking MRI image. Yeah, so. Okay, and so I'm talking about lesion studies, but as I mentioned, those have some flaws, but there's a lot of other evidence for this affective pain pathway. The insula and the anterior cingulate have a high number of opioid binding sites, and morphine also can sort of result in these cases where people say that they still feel pain, but it no longer bothers them as much. So there's a sort of nice cohesion there. There's imaging studies, single unit recordings that all kind of indicate that, brain regions are selectively involved in this sort of affective dimension of pain. Okay, so the upshot of this, I claim, is that whereas we might once have thought that pains are always unpleasant, these dissociations suggest that pain experience is actually a composition of different things, and a specific component of pain is what accounts for unpleasantness, right? So it's not just pain itself that has this sort of morally interesting dimension, but it's a specific aspect of pain, this affective component of painful experience. And so just returning to the points I wanted to make about lesion studies, we can demonstrate the phenomenon that we previously thought might have just been one thing, that you can actually sort of split it into different components. Okay, so what does this tell us, though, about other species? What about other mammals, for example? Well, mammals have cingulate and insula cortices. And in mammals, I would argue, I don't really have time to get into the details, but maybe in Q&A, we have a nice convergence of behavioral and neuroanatomical evidence that suggests that those brain regions operate in them very similarly to the way that they operate in humans. And so, so that we can sort of conclude that they experience this affective dimension of pain in a way that's very similar to human beings. But the real interesting question, I think, comes up when we look at other non-mammalian species. So non-mammalian species do not have cingulate cortices. They do not have insula cortices. And so we might ask, should we should we conclude from this that they actually lack this affective dimension of pain, that they lack the unpleasantness dimension that we think is the sort of morally, or at least I should speak for myself, that I think is the sort of morally relevant dimension of pain experience, and therefore that they sort of lack a certain moral status that mammals have. Of course, this seems like a very problematic type of reasoning because birds, reptiles, bees, cephalopods, fish show a lot of different of those types of behaviors that we think are sort of indicative of painful experience in mammals. So it seems like it would be sort of a leap too far to want to suggest that they're not capable of feeling pain just because they lack these certain brain regions. Just a couple examples. Conditioned place preferences is sometimes thought to be a sort of important indicator of painful experience, and young chicks can do conditioned place preferences. Trace conditioning is a specific type of learning that some people have suggested is a special type of learning that can only occur in humans when they're consciously aware of something, and that they've demonstrated trace conditioning in rainbow trout. So we have behavioral evidence that sort of conflicts with this neuroanatomical point that they lack the brain regions that seem to be involved in our painful experiences. Okay, so returning to this question, are cortical regions necessary for pain perception and specifically for the affective dimension of pain? Well, I want to highlight a couple things about the lesion studies that I think add interesting context to this question. And specifically, I want to point out that there are, in fact, lesion studies that kind of show the opposite of what I earlier presented. Cingulate lesions, as I mentioned, are used to treat people who have chronic pain. And interestingly, so you do the cingulotomy and the people say that they still have their old pain, but it doesn't bother them anymore. But if you poke them or do some new painful activity, they'll react just as vigorously or maybe even more vigorously than they did previously. Right? So they're not incapable of experiencing any pain. They just say that their old pains no longer bother them as much. So clearly the cingulate is sort of not necessary in a certain sense for any type of pain to occur, since they're still capable of having some pains, just not having the affective dimension of other pains. And another point that's worth noting that I'll come back to is that the old pains eventually come back. So the reason that cingulotomies are only used in terminal cancer patients is because after a couple years, eventually the chronic pains return in those patients. So it's not a sort of permanent fix to these problems. We can't all just go out and get cingulotomies and sort of, breathe easy. Eventually this sort of pain comes back. Okay, so what about the insula lesions? That was the other main brain region. A nice study from Christopher Starr and Robert Coghill's lab at Wake Forest, I think he's moved from Wake Forest now, but showed that patients with insula lesions could still report experiencing pain. So they said both individuals, they looked at 2 individuals, it said both retained the ability to evaluate pain despite substantial insular damage and no evidence of detectable insula activity. These results indicate that the insula may be importantly involved in tuning cortical regions to appropriately use previous cognitive information during afferent processing. And they suggest that a subjectively available experience of pain can be instantiated by brain mechanisms that do not require the insular cortex. Okay, so one objection you might raise to this is that, of course, the brain has 2 hemispheres, and the patients they looked at only had damage to 1 hemisphere. So you might say, well, if the insula is involved in pain affect, maybe it's just the other insula on the other hemisphere that's doing the work, even if there's damage in one part of the insula. One thing to note about that is that the other types of cases that were used as examples of pain asymbolia also just involved damage to 1 hemisphere. So you'd have to have a little bit more explanation for why these cases are different from those cases. But better argument is just the fact that Damasio's lab has a patient who has severe bilateral damage to the insula. So both hemispheres are damaged, also the anterior cingulate and the medial prefrontal cortices. And those patients, you can see pictures of all the massive damage. Those patients still report feeling pleasure, pain, itch, tickle, happiness, sadness, apprehension, irritation, blah, 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 blah. But main point for us is that they still experience pain despite all of that damage. Okay, but another thing you might ask is, well, didn't you say it's the affective component of pain that's missing? And Damasio's study, I think, was kind of targeted at this particular argument by Bud Craig that suggested that the insula is the sort of seat of all consciousness. And so they were mostly concerned with just showing, well, look, these people are clearly conscious even though their insula is damaged. So they didn't really get fine-grained about distinguishing between pain and pain unpleasantness. But there are other researchers who have also done these studies and have shown that even with damage to the insula, cingulate, amygdala, pain affect specifically still continues to persist. So this other study showed that not only did this patient still have pain, they actually had a heightened degree of pain affects despite having damage to the insula cortex. Okay, so upshot of this, I claim, is that pain, and specifically the unpleasantness of pain, can occur in humans regardless of damage to any particular cortical region, right? So there's no, we looked at the top candidates of cortical regions that seem to be involved in this unpleasantness, and nevertheless, the unpleasantness of pain can occur even when those particular brain regions are damaged. And I think this helps us to sort of distinguish between 2 notions of the word necessary, that, sometimes we talk about a brain region being necessary for something. And I think it's actually helpful to kind of distinguish between cases where different ways of using the term necessary. So weak necessity, I would say, is that a brain region X is necessary for pain if normal activity in that brain region is required for an organism O to experience pain at a time T, right? So it's sort of a localized description of saying, in order to have pain at a time T, this person has to have activity in a certain brain region. And I think we can claim that the anterior cingulate and the insula do meet this sort of weak notion of necessity in certain cases, right? Where if you impair their activity in particular people at particular times, then you're going to reliably block the unpleasantness of their painful experience. But the more relevant notion of necessity for these sort of arguments about which species can feel pain or not is strong necessity. And strong necessity would claim that a brain region X is necessary for pain if normal activity is required for any organism to experience pain, right? So it's not just a saying, this person needs to have this thing going on at a certain time. It's saying, this brain region is required for pain, full stop, or this type of brain activity is required for pain, full stop. and only strong necessity would rule out pain in other species that lack that certain brain region or that certain capacity. Okay, so going back to my 3 thoughts about lesion methods, I think that they can nicely demonstrate that particular brain regions are not necessary in the strong sense for particular cognitive functions, right? So if you can show that you can still have unpleasant pains without an insula cortex, the insula cortex is not necessary in the strong sense for painful experience. Okay, and then the last thing I wanted to say about lesion studies, and the thing that I think is most promising and maybe most interesting, is that these cases where new brain regions take up the processing of damaged regions might actually tell us something important about how the processing is taking place. There might actually be something interesting to learn about the fact that the pains come back, or that there's this sort of plasticity involved. So just to get a little bit more specific, going back to the Starr et al. Study that looked at a patient with an insula lesion, the interesting thing that they reported on, which unfortunately they didn't follow up much about, was that both lesion patients exhibited consistently greater activation of S1 than during stimulation of the unaffected side. And that may reflect a recruitment of additional S1 activity to compensate for the loss of the contribution of the insula to sensory processing. These findings indicate that insular activity, although frequently observed in studies of pain, may not be necessary to elicit a conscious pain experience. Thus, subjective awareness of pain intensity can be realized via multiple distinct patterns of brain activity. So just to sort of put it back in sort of common language, when people initially have an insula lesion, it looks as though they have this sort of impairment, but over time, these people are, the patients they were talking about had lesions for a long time. It looks like other brain regions sort of adapted to compensate for the fact that the insula was no longer playing this role, right? So there's sort of, because of the brain's plasticity, other types of brain regions can seem to be able to play the same role. Similarly, in the cases of people who have cingulotomies, the pain eventually comes back, right? It's not a long-term or an indefinite chronic pain fix. It works for a certain amount of time, and then the chronic pain, and specifically the unpleasantness of the chronic pain, comes back. So there's this interesting phenomenon that the brain sort of adjusts over enough time to sort of regain this capacity to represent the affective dimension of pain. So I think these cases show that different brain tissue can play the role of facilitating pain than those regions that normally play this functional role. And so they demonstrate that pain's unpleasantness is not dependent upon particular brain regions. In particular, affective pain is realizable by multiple brain regions. So I think this is a very interesting finding. You might still ask, if you're sort of a skeptic about other species, you might, or sort of non-mammalian species, you might say, well, maybe only other cortical regions can sort of play this role that the insula and anterior cingulate would play, right? So we know that there's some plasticity where different regions can play this role, but we don't know which regions, and maybe it's only other parts of the cerebral cortex, and therefore you could sort of rule out other species. But given, I think, the sort of strong behavioral evidence that other species like birds, reptiles, amphibians, fish, crustaceans, cephalopods, bees, maybe a little more questionable, but good topic for discussion. There doesn't seem to be a good reason to deny that only cortical regions are able to play this role, now that we already know that sort of multiple types of brain regions can do the same thing. But we might still ask what types of behaviors we should be looking for, right? So we have this idea of sort of behavioral regions that play a role, or sort of behavioral indicators of pain. But we might want to ask, well, what behaviors are really specific to this affective dimension of pain that can really help us to understand which other beings are capable of suffering from pain? So one thing I think that the sort of fact that there's weak necessity but not strong necessity can help show is that the fact that these two different brain regions are sort of playing the same role at different times might actually give us an opportunity where we can sort of look at the similarities between what say, the anterior cingulate was doing at a certain time to what happens when the pain comes back, or the affective dimension of pain comes back and is then processed in a new brain region, can we look for similarities between those two situations and sort of extract some general feature about the types of computational processing that's going on that might tell us something interesting about what this affective dimension of pain is actually doing, or what these brain regions are doing as they're operating. So it might tell us something very interesting about what to look for in other species, although it could also be still, just like other types of measures, that might still be biased towards uniquely human traits, right? So if you're only looking at 2 cortical regions, you might still mistakenly infer that there's something unique about the cortex that's doing this, when in fact other types of things could do it. Okay, so I hope to have shown that cases where new brain regions take up the processing of damaged regions might tell us something important about how the processing is taking place. But I still think there's a sort of this big question kind of lurking in the background of, what should we really be looking for if we're sort of trying to understand what the affective dimension of pain actually is. And unfortunately, I think there's sort of a mistaken focus to some degree, where we're constantly sort of looking for these measures in non-human animals that we think might be good replicas of self-report in humans, because we use self-report as the gold standard for humans. But there's not very much attention paid to what types of things might be reliable indicators of pain in humans that are not self-report, or specifically the affective dimension of pain. Is there some sort of correlate, behavioral or neural correlate, that we can look for that doesn't rely on self-report in humans? And if we find that, then we might have a better sense of what we might want to look for in other species. So just sort of questions about how we might better look at humans in a way that can help tell us something interesting about the affective dimension of pain. So I mentioned some problems with the Lesion method. There are lots of limitations to the Lesion method, and specifically allowing natural lesions to sort of tell us something. But of course, we also can do more precise targeted lesions, but we have ethical reasons for not wanting to do too much of that. So for example, I think the sort of main reasons we wouldn't want to just go around lesioning people randomly is that there's a risk of irreversible harm from the loss of brain function. And of course, there's the risk of complications from surgery, right? So if someone dies on the table, that's a bad outcome. So we want to be cautious about, just causing lesions haphazardly in people. But what if, imagine a world in which we could cause reversible lesions that did not necessarily have an irreversible long-term effect. If we could temporarily block functioning in particular brain regions without sort of doing something that we can't take back later. Well, in fact, I'm sure some people have already anticipated we actually can do this. We're now at the point where we do have methods that we can use to sort of mimic lesions, or to do things that are sort of reversible versions of lesions that can temporarily impair the activity of particular brain regions. But nevertheless, if it's going wrong, you can sort of stop doing it. So one method is transcranial magnetic stimulation, which basically, you sort of induce a strong current in a coil, and it creates this magnetic field and generates electric activity that sort of basically sort of blocks out activity in a particular part of the brain. We've had TMS for a long time, but for a long time, it was thought that TMS could only really get at the surface cortical regions, just because of the way it's sort of built. It only, extends, sort of a couple inches down, and so it can only sort of reach these surface areas. But in the last maybe, 5-10 years or something like that, they developed a double coil TMS, which is sort of TMS shaped at this angle, which, I don't understand the physics of it, but basically the sort of main point of electrical activity generation is way out here rather than here. And so these can reach deeper areas of the brain and sort of selectively impair particular regions more easily. So one example of this is the insula. If you guys, you guys probably didn't look super closely at all my brain pictures, but the insula is buried, pretty deep in the brain, and nevertheless, researchers have now used the double coil TMS in order to sort of selectively stimulate the insula as a sort of target for activity. But nevertheless, and so actually at the University of Penn, so for all the people who disparage philosophers, I actually did manage to get some clinician friends of mine to sort of run a trial experiment using TMS, double coil TMS, to try to get at, to try to selectively stimulate the insula to see if you could selectively impair this affective dimension of pain. And we did get a slight deviation between sensory and affective ratings, but unfortunately it wasn't quite as dramatic as I was hoping, so it sort of fell off the wayside. But I don't think in general TMS is probably strong enough to sort of do the things we want it to do. But I think a more promising method is deep brain stimulation, which basically involves surgery to sort of implant an electrode sort of deep in the brain that can stimulate very precise regions of the brain, or relatively precise, I guess I should say. And so this actually has already been used in one of the brain regions I've been talking about, where people who had intractable pain that couldn't be solved with opioids, any other spinal cord surgeries, any other type of painkillers, had deep brain stimulation of the anterior cingulate. And it did work on several of the patients where they had the same report of feeling the pain, but no longer finding it unpleasant. But unfortunately, some of those patients also still developed epileptic seizures. And so NHS kind of pulled the plug on it, despite the fact that some people wanted to sort of continue it. And now they're sort of playing with the settings to see if they can find a nice setting where they can get the effect without generating seizures. But anyways, I think this sort of raises an interesting question, and I wanted to sort of mention something that I hope is provocative that sort of occurred to me as I was preparing this presentation, which is just, how should we treat people who have suffering, intense suffering that can't be treated through any of our traditional methods? And so recall these sort of ethical worries we had about targeted brain regions. There's the risk of irreversible harm from the loss of the brain region, and there's also risk of complications from surgery. So in the case of deep brain stimulation, the first concern really no longer applies, right? It's no longer irreversible. It's something that you can turn on or off when needed. So you sort of lose that worry. And what about the risk of complications from surgery? Well, the risk of complications from surgery isn't really that high. It's getting better every year. And brain surgery is already something that we sort of will perform on patients in order to respect their autonomy if we think that there are sort of good benefits that they can get out of it. And so I think the second worry is sort of not as pressing as you might think. So with that in mind, I think given how poor animal models are at replicating human psychiatric disorders, this might be a contentious claim, but I think that in general, animal models there's been a huge string of failures of animal models to reliably give us ways of treating depression, pain, anxiety, right? Those things still exist despite lots of years of studies on mice and rats. So given how poor some of the animal models perform, shouldn't we maybe be much more open to using things like deep brain stimulation experimentally to try to treat cases of severe suffering that are impervious to other methods? Like maybe we should sort of liberalize our thoughts on brain surgery, which is sort of this boogeyman word, to maybe use techniques like this in cases where people who are suffering, they sort of have no other method, and the no way of treating it. Maybe we should sort of give them a chance to treat it, and hope that sort of it's better than the animal models. And also sort of just returning to the main point, this, if we could sort of selectively target these regions in humans, especially humans who have this sort of intractable pain, that would actually give us a much better understanding of the sort of underlying behavioral correlates of suffering in human beings. Like which aspects, if you could really just specifically turn the insula on and off, how could you, what behavioral changes would result from that? What processing, how would neural processing change as a result of that? And I think that would give us a much more precise type of correlates that we could look for in other species that might help inform us when we're looking at this question of which other species are sentient or not. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Adam. We will now listen to Fernanda for about 5 minutes. Is that it, Fernanda? Okay. So Fernanda Perez Gay Suarez got her medical degree in 2013 in Mexico City. And she's now a postdoctoral fellow in psychology at UCAM and completing a PhD on the neural correlates of category learning in the integrated neuroscience program at McGill University. Thank you.
Thank you. So I had brought up PPT, but now I see that we have a lot of similar slides, or some of my slides were already in Adam's presentation. I swear I did not see the presentation before. So, but I'm going to add some other things. So first of all, the first article I read from Professor Shriver was his answer to this article that came out in Animal Sentience about fish being unable to feel pain by Key. So the argument that Key was using was that fish lack the basic circuitry for feeling pain, and therefore they cannot feel pain. So I'm going to come back on it, and then on his discussion and his response, Adam Shriver was coming back to lesion studies, saying, well, yes, it's true that in humans there's the affective component of pain that is located in the cortex, but does this mean that fish do not feel pain because they don't have a cortex? So I come from a medical background. So my first approach to the mind and to brain and function were human lesion studies that, as we've already heard about, started when Paul Broca reported his case on his patient Tan that had an impaired language function. And then in the autopsy, he saw that there was this region of the brain that was damaged. And afterwards, he reported a series of cases. Every one of them had a language impaired, and every one of them had this region impaired. So this was kind of a paradigm shift in neuroscience, because before that there was a huge discussion of if we could actually localize function. There were some people that thought that all the cortex was functioning in a unified way for every possible function, and that we could not localize function. And this was also a reject from previous attempts to localizing function, such as phrenology. There was, as you know, a pseudoscientific attempt to localize function by touching people's skulls and saying, well, if he has a big protrusion here, it means that he's altruistic or stuff like that. So the important thing about this paradigm shift was that since Paul Broca, we had a scientific basis for localizing functions in the brain and in the nervous system. So we already heard about Phineas Gage and some other cases that came afterwards, in which lesion studies helped us to understand how the human brain worked. So this is a case that I saw in 2012 when I was back in Mexico City in the National Institute of Neurology and Neurosurgery. The description is in Spanish, but I will go through it. So this was a patient, a 62-year-old woman, that arrived to the emergency room because she had very severe headaches. So 10 on 10 reported, she was reporting her pain on the highest of the scale. So she came to the ER. And while she was on the ER, she started having mood swings and reporting behaving in a euphoric way. She was laughing. She was speaking very quickly and being very affectionate with all the hospital personnel working there. So she was sent to the psychiatric unit to be assessed for mania, for manic symptoms. Eventually, she went into an MRI. And she was at first she was still reporting pain, but as the day progressed, she started to laugh about her pain or speak positively about her pain. So when she went to an MRI, what they saw was that she had a lesion on her insula on the right side. So they've already, Professor Shriver has already spoke to us about the insula and its role in the affective function of pain. So she had a lesion on the insula, and the interesting thing about it was that she came because she was feeling pain, and while the vessels were closing and the insula was receiving less and less blood, and therefore the insula was being damaged, she started feeling happy or reporting pleasant feelings about everything, including her pain. So this is a case of asymbolia for pain that was also described. And then this was because she had an aneurysm that ruptured. So blood started, when an aneurysm ruptures, our body closes the vessels so that the bleeding, so you don't bleed out, right? So while the vessels were closing, the blood stopped arriving to the insula, and she started behaving in an euphoric way and reporting that her pain was making her laugh and stuff like that, saying things like, "Oh yeah, my head was going to explode, and that's so funny, and that's so good." And this is a kind of an anecdote that shows how interesting it can be, or how seductive it can be to learn about the brain through brain lesions, right? You're seeing the person, and through a part of her brain gets damaged, you see a change in behavior, you see a change of some of the mental functions. So this is when you're studying medicine, it can be very impressive. But that being said, it's also important to say that there's a lot of limitations. Some of those were already explained or mentioned by Adam Shriver, in which when you try to explain human brain function or the human mind through brain lesion studies, the first of those is the idiosyncratic component of each lesion. So these are all case reports. When people report this kind of phenomenon, they do it person by person, and it can change very much when you go from one to the other. The second one is plasticity. So a similar case to the one described here was reported by Starr, and Adam already spoke about it. So there was a patient that had damage to the insula, but she was still feeling pain. She was still feeling the unpleasantness associated with pain, and they saw with fMRI that there were other regions in the cortex that were active during while she was reporting pain. Then the third one is the dynamic network perspective. So right now, neuroscience is a little bit moving away. There's being another paradigm shift in which we're not speaking about brain areas anymore, but about networks, areas that are connected with other areas, and everything's kind of like brain circuits, right? So in this case, these areas are not the seat of a function anymore, but hubs in a very big circuitry that includes the circuitry that goes down to the spinal cord and to the nerves. So this is another very coarse, rough way of showing that the absence, so lesioning in structure does not imply that the absence of a structure equals the absence of function. So lesion studies tell us that people that have lesions, for example, in the cerebellum, cannot have coordinated movements and cannot walk or cannot speak in a coordinated way. So this is a case that was reported in 2014 of a woman that did not have a cerebellum. And she lived 24 years without realizing it. She was a little bit clumsy, her gait was not very steady, but she could still do most of the things that a normal person does. So this is just to say that even in humans, the absence of a structure does not imply absence of function, so in a very rough way. So let's imagine extrapolating this to other species. So coming back to if the cortex is necessary or not necessary for pain, we already saw that asymbolia does not mean anesthesia. It means the absence of the unpleasantness of pain. And then going to the problem of definitions. So when we speak about the difference between nociception and pain, or the distinctions that were being said, where these are mostly anatomical and physiological, speaking about humans. So in humans, this part we associated with nociception, this part we associated with pain. But what happens when we go to animals that have different nervous systems, especially when we go to invertebrates that do not share the same evolutive nervous system structure? So just going back to the central question of this summer school, can we understand animals' unpleasantness, suffering, or awareness? What does this imply in animals? Is our pain the only type of pain? So if we ask me, like, can fish feel the same pain that we do? Of course not. They will not rhyme. They will never write poems about pain. But does this mean that they cannot feel pain? So just some food for thought for the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Fernanda. So I guess we'll take questions now to both speakers. So if Etienne, Stephen, if you want to start.
This is for Adam. Adam, all of us, especially here at McGill, learn that story about I still feel pain, but it doesn't hurt anymore. So I had that in mind when I said to you, what do you mean it doesn't hurt? Let's get rid of the semantics, okay? What we mean by pain is something that hurts. If you ask a patient, do you still feel the pain? And he says, yes, I still feel it, but it doesn't hurt anymore. He's not saying it still hurts, but it doesn't hurt. What he's saying is that I can recognize the sensation that I used to call hurtful, but now I just recognize the sensation that was causing it. That's the natural interpretation. Unless the patients themselves are just saying it still hurts, but it hurts so little that I wouldn't call it pain. But it's not some other thing. And what's really behind that is sentience. I mean, I agree with you that what matters morally about all this is negative sentience and pain. But the question of whether there's sentience or not is exactly parallel to the question of whether there's pain or not. Pain is just a particular form of sentience. I could ask about Jim's bats. Yeah, they're responding to echolocation. Does it feel like something to respond to echolocation? The animals that do optical transduction, you can say, does it feel like something to do optical transduction? If it doesn't feel like anything, then you're out of the domain of sentience. Obviously, if nociception feels like something, then there's some sort of a sensation that's going through, and we're asking, is that thing that's going through what we call pain, or is it just some other sensory modality?
Yeah, so I don't particularly care about how we choose to define pain. It's fine with me if we want to say pain is always something that's necessarily unpleasant. Even if that's true, we can still distinguish between cases where people say, I feel a sensation, but I don't find it unpleasant, even though that sensation is something I previously associated with pain. And we can distinguish that between cases where people still feel the unpleasantness. I think, but I disagree with how I understand your second point, because in those cases where people say they still have the sensation, but it's no longer unpleasant, they are still sentient. They're still having a conscious experience.
We're both agreed about that.
But it's no longer a valenced conscious experience. And so it lacks the sort of moral significance of the affective
exactly.
component.
I agree about that too. I just want to know why you insist on calling. They say to the neurologist, because the neurologist doesn't give them a subtle choice like, are you feeling a bodily sensation that used to hurt? They could say yes to that without saying, yes, I still have the pain, but it doesn't hurt anymore. That's paradoxical.
Oh, okay. I mean, I see the reasoning for that. I don't think it's sort of central and sort of understanding.
It's central because what makes the whole question moral is whether it hurts, not whether it feels like something. When we're talking about not wanting to hurt animals, to do things to animals that are sentient, it's not because we don't want to tickle them. It's because we don't want to hurt them.
Right. But if we agree that it's the affective component of pain that is the hurtfulness. What? I thought you said you agreed that the people who said they had a sensation.
I don't believe in this bimodal thing that there's a sensation called pain and then it has an affective component. There's a sensation called pain and it hurts. If it doesn't hurt, it's a somatic sensation that resembles pain or that pain approximates if you get it down to 0, but it's not pain. Pain hurts.
Yeah, it doesn't really cut any of my main arguments, because I'm just saying here's the relevant thing that we should care about, and here's a way of sort of parsing it. So however you want to define pain doesn't particularly get at that, other than the fact that if you agree there are some sensations that don't have this affective component, whether or not you call them pain, then it follows that not all conscious experience is valenced. And so we need to think that all conscious experience has the same moral dimension. So all I'm saying is we need to be more fine-grained about saying these are the particular types of phenomenal experiences that have this intrinsically disvaluable component, and there are other types that don't, and we need to be sort of precise about which ones we're pointing to. And I think the definitions sort of don't tie in that closely. I could see why, if you want to say, okay, sentience is what matters, and I'm saying something like, oh, it seems like sentience doesn't matter, then it's fine with me if we want to define sentience as only those experiences which have a positive or negative valence, but that might also rule out certain types of experiences.
Okay, so we'll have a question from you, sir.
Hi. So you did mention that we could, it's hard to learn from lesion brain injuries because there's so many aspects of pains. But what about self-harming behaviors? So pain is an aversing feeling that we don't want to feel. But in some case, people with very advanced dementia, such as Alzheimer, they start to get into self-harming behavior because there's a change in the volume of their brains. So could it be related to that rather than a region, but a quantity of neuron?
I don't know as much about the Alzheimer's cases. I do know that in sort of teenagers, there's also a lot of sort of self-harming behavior, and in those types of cases, I think, I mean, I don't know if they know exactly what's going on, but at least sometimes the idea is that the pain can sort of distract from other types of feelings, and so even if it's sort of unpleasant, it's sort of drawing your attention away from other things that might be even more unpleasant. I don't know enough about the Alzheimer's type cases. I don't know if you...
I do think that in Alzheimer's, it's more related to the incapacity to stop your own impulses and instincts. So these patients are anxious, such as sometimes like dogs, when they're anxious, they start, when they have like an unpleasant feeling or they're uncomfortable, they start biting themselves and they don't stop until they hurt themselves. So some people with dementia, especially with frontal dementias or with frontal correlates of dementia, don't have the capacity to stop their impulse and saying, oh, I'm hurting myself, I'm going to stop. So it's kind of more of like a...
But do you think that where they're self-harming, they're not feeling the pain at the moment, and that's why they...
I don't think it's because they're not feeling the pain. I just think they're unable to stop.
Oh, thank you.
Sir?
I don't know if I understood the argument between the two of you, so my question will make me realize if I did or not. If you're listening to music, it feels good, depending on the song you're listening to. It feels good. If you're listening to loud music, it's fine. If you're listening to too loud music, is it pain? Does it hurt? You know, warm temperature, it's fine, but once it gets you, it feels like it burns, then it becomes pain. So is pain something subjective and nociception more objective perception of something that is harmful to the body, or?
Okay, so I don't know. I hope this might shed light on that debate. So basically, there's sort of these sensory properties that usually accompany pain, and so but if you have these rare, and because they're so commonly associated with, because pain is so commonly associated with those sensory properties, if you have someone where the two things are dissociated, then patients will say, oh, I still feel pain, but it no longer bothers me. But as Stephen is saying, what they really mean is, I'm having these sensory properties that I previously always had, with pain, and which I always use the term pain to describe. So I will say I still feel pain now, even though it's missing this other sort of dimension. So I think that's sort of what's going on in the sort of dissociation cases.
But someone having that same sensation, but is not used to this sensation, would call it pain, that it hurts, right? So that's why I'm asking, is it subjective? Is pain subjective to the individual depending on their habituation to the sensation or just their pleasure?
Well, if I don't know, I mean, I guess my prediction, and I would guess Stephen's prediction, would be if people had never had those sensations before and they had the sensory component without the affective component, then they wouldn't be tempted to call it pain or suffering because they wouldn't have those previous sort of association with it. But just to sort of return to your other point, I mean, I think another thing that's really interesting about this affective component of pain is that part of the pain experience is something that does seem to be shared with other types, at least some other types of aversive experiences. I think this was sort of referenced, maybe you mentioned it earlier, so like cases of social exclusion. These researchers designed this video game where people thought they were playing with two other people, and then eventually the other people, they were actually just a computer program, but they eventually just started passing the ball between themselves on this computer game, and the people felt bad as a result of that. And actually these affective brain regions were active during the feeling of badness in those cases. Loud music might be another case that seems intuitively like it might be sort of drawing on something similar to this affective dimension. So I think there are these sort of other systems that seem to have this unpleasantness that some people have argued have sort of co-opted this particular dimension of pain that's used as a sort of warning, a neural alarm system, and sort of co-opted it for other types of uses. I know that's not sort of directly addressing your question, so feel free to.
Yeah, well, you mentioned the computer experiment, but wouldn't that be something that is a gradient up to a certain point that one individual would call it pain or something that is not fun for them, and some other individual would have to wait longer with the two computers exchanging the ball within themselves? I don't know if you understand what I'm saying, but
maybe, yeah. So maybe I'm getting
like loud music. Okay, like let's say 65 decibels. I think I'm just saying a number like that. It's harmful for one individual, but for another individual, it would be 70 decibels that would be harmful.
Oh, good. Okay, sorry.
I mean?
Yeah, sorry. I totally misunderstood, but I think that's a great question. So, and it's really interesting too. So, so the question is, could two people have the same sensation and one person thinks it's painful and the other person doesn't think it's painful? And I think another interesting thing that comes out of this sort of sensory affective dissociation is that, we know there are individual differences between people in what they consider painful or not. Like, if you put a heat thermode on me, it might give you a different result than putting it on another person. But interestingly, it turns out that the sort of sensitivity to pain is very correlated with the affective component of it. So even if you're giving the sort of same physical stimulus, the person who reacts more strongly to that stimulus tends to have more activation in these affective brain regions. So it's subjective in a sense, but there's also sort of nice neural correlates of how sensitive people are to the thing.
Thanks.
We'll have a question from here.
Yes, my question is this dissociation between pain and unpleasantness, do you see it also on a positive, like pleasure and pleasantness?
So there's this sort of famous work by a neuroscientist at Michigan, Kent Berridge, who has distinguished between liking and wanting. And so the basic idea is that they used to think the dopamine was the pleasure chemical, basically the pleasure neurotransmitter. And it turns out that dopamine tends to be actually sort of more involved in sort of motivated behavior. And you can get these nice dissociations where people sort of have a strong motivation to get something, but then when they get it, they no longer seem to get pleasure from it, and also vice versa, where you can get cases where people seem to feel pleasure from something, but they no longer have a motivation to pursue it. So there's a sort of somewhat similar idea between those cases, but I actually think they're a little different in that I think In the case of pleasure, you can dissociate the physical sensation from the motivation, and both of those things from the pleasure itself. And then in the case of pain, you can dissociate the sensation from the unpleasantness. But I think there's an interesting question about whether the unpleasantness of pain can be dissociated from the motivation, because there's a sense in which the sort of badness of pain seems to be sort of an immediate feeling of wanting to avoid that thing. And so those things might be more tightly linked in pain than they are in pleasure.
Okay, we have about 6 to 7 minutes left, so we'll take maybe one over there, one question here, and okay, so Jen, you can.
Okay, so this is for Adam. You said that when people have had cingulate lesions, they still have the same behavioral response to new pain. Is that the same thing to you as saying that the new pain still feels the same way? And do you think that behavior is more important than looking at the brain when you're trying to decide what someone is feeling?
Good question. I mean, I think there's a pretty limited number of studies that have sort of shown this effect. So I definitely would be happy to see more research into exactly what's going on and how the patients respond to new noxious stimuli. In terms of the question about is neural activity more or less reliable than behavioral activity, I mean, I do feel like if we have no reason to think people are being dishonest or lying, I do think we have a strong reason to sort of defer to behavioral data. If people genuinely say, I'm not experiencing anything bad right now, maybe it's just intuition, but it seems to me like we shouldn't say, oh, well, your brain actually says you are in pain, so we're going to shoot you up with morphine or something like that. So I do think, in terms of getting at the experience, we somewhat have to rely on our own way of experiencing the world. And so I think relying on people's self-reports and behavior is an important component of understanding what's going on in this affective dimension.
Thank you, Adam. So we have 5 minutes left. So we'll go with the lady here first and the gentleman after.
It's so quickly, and it's a contribution. Do you know your Merck article about the hydroencephalic children? I think it's a contribution. I think it's the same way that you are exposing your ideas, and about the affective neuroscience too. Other researchers like Jack Pansep, Antonio Damasio, and I think they are going to this way of thinking about affective elements that are older in evolution, that participates of the sensations of the. I think there are many other researchers that are thinking at the same way.
Yeah, right. There's some studies about hydroencephalic infants that still seem to show sort of pain behavior. Jack Panksepp, as you mentioned, did some sort of direct stimulation experiments where he showed that I think stimulating the para-aqueductal gray would result in behaviors that looked like pain behaviors. So that might be additional evidence that it's not the cortical regions that are sort of centrally involved. So yeah, I agree. Thanks.
Thank you.
I have some difficulties with your distinction between nociception and pain. The way you define nociception seems to me kind of removed from biological reality. I cannot see a nociceptive system without the generation of an internal negative state. You somehow made, in my opinion, artificial distinction. It's like you took a whole system and divided it. Of course, a system is complex. You can divide it into components. But I think it's artificial. I don't think you'll find it in a real animal.
I think you're right that nociception generally accompanies pain. But I mean, if you're trying to ask whether two things, I mean, maybe this is sort of a methodological thing from philosophy that maybe that's why you don't like it. But but the idea is that, you know, if you're trying to claim that two things are the same thing, then it has to be the case that they apply to all the same cases. So the fact that they accompany each other most of the time doesn't show that it's actually the same thing. So if you can show one single instance of nociception without pain or pain without nociception, then it follows that they're not referring to the same thing. They're not identical. So I think that's sort of what was motivating my points, which, you know, I agree. They usually occur together. Nevertheless, you can have some instances of nociception without pain and some instances of pain without nociception. And so they need to be distinct concepts for that reason.
Good answer. So just to clarify, the way I said it is I expect nociception to be always associated with a negative internal state. I don't call it pain. I leave open the possibility that there are varieties of negative states. We know pain from humans. We don't know pain in non-humans. So there could be variation in how the negative state in the brain is interpreted. That's what I'm saying.
Okay. And I mean, do you think that, would you agree that in any case where we have a negative internal state that we are aware of that negative internal state, or you think that it might be possible for us to have it without being aware of it?
Yeah, I don't talk about awareness. I don't understand awareness. So I'm just talking about a negative state that you can measure in the brain, basically.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, right. So I think, I don't know, I guess it's sort of hard to know sort of how to argue against that. If it's not sort of dependent on self-report, or if it's sort of independent of how people report it, you could say, oh, you have a negative state even though you're not aware of it. It's sort of, I don't know, it seems challenging to me to know how to evaluate whether that's the right way to classify it or not. So.
Excuse me, if I can suggest that the discussion follows at the coming panel. So I would like to thank Adam and Fernanda for this very interesting talks.